Hello, my name is Kent Wong. I'm the director of the UCLA Labor Center, and I would like to welcome all of you to week 8 of our UCLA class on nonviolence and social movements taught by Reverend James Lawson Jr. And we are so thrilled today to have with us an old and dear friend of Reverend Lawson, who has been an international leader in the fight against apartheid and in the fight for human justice and human dignity. So I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Reverend Allan Boesak.
Yes, welcome, Allan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, friends. It's a joy to be with you tonight, and I'm so happy to be part of this important discussion this evening.
Good.
Thank you. So I'm going to lead off with a very short slideshow just to capture some images that place the extraordinary role that Reverend Boesak has played as a leader of the fight against apartheid. So if you'll bear with me, I'll share my screen and then show this very short PowerPoint. So this is a short slideshow on Reverend Allan Boesak and the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa. Reverend Boesak was a leader of the United Democratic Front from 1983 to 1991. This was an organization that played a crucial role in mobilizing broad-based support to mobilize against the apartheid regime, but also to generate international support for the people of South Africa. Reverend Boesak has worked closely with President Nelson Mandela, as well as with Bishop Desmond Tutu. And here is a historic photo under the banner, "Defend Democracy, Forward to Freedom." Reverend Boesak is an internationally renowned theologian. His book, Dare We Speak of Hope, which I just had the opportunity of reading, eloquently links the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and the Black liberation struggle in the United States. His teachings and writings have inspired people throughout the world. And Reverend Boesak has not only connected with international leaders in the fight against apartheid and for human justice and dignity, he has also taught for many years within the United States. And so he has an especially strong following of people who have worked with him here in the US. His work has generated international support for South African liberation, including the anti-apartheid movement right here at the University of California. And so here is a massive student-led protest when students throughout the University of California were demanding that our public university divest from holdings that were propping up the apartheid regime. And so his impact and his influence has absolutely reached the campus community here within the University of California. And so we are very pleased to be joined today with Reverend Allan Boesak for this important conversation on nonviolence and the anti-apartheid struggle. And so the first question goes to you, Reverend Boesak, as a leader in the anti-apartheid movement for many years, as one who has worked closely with both Nelson Mandela and Bishop Desmond Tutu. What do you see as the role of nonviolence resistance in ending the apartheid regime?
Well, thank you very much. And once again, I'm so happy to be with you. If I think of the role of nonviolence in our own liberation struggle, there's one word that comes to mind that sums it all up, and that's the word unmissable. I think that without the nonviolent resistance driven especially by our people internally in South Africa, we would never have been able to conquer apartheid. Keep in mind, let me just make 4 quick points. Just keep in mind that from the formation of the first formal political organizations, Black political organizations in this country, the African People's Organization in 1908 and the African National Congress in 1912, the resistance was a thing that some people call gentlemanly politics. So the gentlemanly politics consisted of petitions to the Queen and petitions to the white minority government in South Africa, deputations that they tried to send, the sending of letters and so forth. And that never really moved the struggle forward. So secondly, after 1948, when the National Party came to power and apartheid became the politics and the policies of the country, and people began to see just how vicious the system was going to be and its effects on the Black communities, then they decided that to step away from that form of nonviolent resistance to another form of nonviolent resistance, as active, militant, nonviolent civil disobedience and actions in the streets. And that sort of led and culminated in the famous campaign that we had in 1952-53 called the Defiance Campaign under the leadership of Chief Albert Luthuli. But the third point is that it was only after the Sharpeville massacre on the 21st of September 1960, when police used live ammunition against a group of marchers demonstrating against the pass laws, unarmed, peaceful marchers, both in Johannesburg and here in Cape Town. It's only after that massacre that the African National Congress, a section of that organization under the leadership of Nelson Mandela, decided to include armed struggle in their form of resistance. That brought some serious tensions between Chief Albert Luthuli on the one hand and Nelson Mandela on the other hand, but everybody now knows that famous speech of Mandela in the dock at his trial for terrorism, where he gave almost a scientific analysis of why, after 50 years of nonviolent struggle, they had decided that because of white intransigence and the viciousness of the government and its only response to our nonviolent efforts was only violence, that they would employ violence. But the last point is that in 1976, with the Soweto Revolution by the youth, under the leadership of the youth, and especially in the 1980s, with the formation of the United Democratic Front, the organization that I called for and helped to lead, and we returned on principle to the nonviolent militant methods of Chief Albert Luthuli and the Defiance Campaign. And that is what marked that whole struggle for that decade between 1983 and 1991, almost. And we brought together, through the mobilization of people, the broadest, most inclusive the organization across the lines of color and race and culture and religion and all of this, even class, rural people and urban people, which the ANC could never do. The ANC was mostly an urban-based organization. The United Democratic Front brought in all of the rural areas from across the country, which was an amazing feat. And without the UDF and its insistence on nonviolent resistance in the country, I do not believe that we would have broken the back of apartheid. And of course, that was the kind of movement that could bring in the solidarity movements from across the world, and especially the solidarity anti-apartheid movement in the United States. And so for us, that looking back, I thought if it were not for the UDF, Nelson Mandela would have died in prison, the exiles would never have come home, and apartheid would still have been on the throne in this country.
Thank you for putting the extraordinary role of the United Democratic Front in historic context, for lifting up the extraordinary work of the Chief Lutuli, and for also lifting up the Sharpeville massacre, back in 1960, that really drew international condemnation
Yes.
to the
Yes.
brutality of the apartheid regime. Last year marked the 60th anniversary of the Sharpeville massacre, and this very month marks the 60th anniversary of the freedom rides, of which Reverend Lawson was a leader of here in the United States. And so, Reverend Lawson, if you might reflect on what do you see as the link between the struggle against apartheid in South Africa and the movement that you helped to inspire in this country for freedom in the United States?
It is so wonderful to have you here in our class today, Allan Boesak. To see you again, even though by Zoom, that is a poor substitute, but it's a good substitute for us to be together again. And I just want to say that 1947, meeting the African National Congress as a freshman in college in the United States in Ohio, and Albert Lutuli, at the same time, not meeting them face to face, but meeting them in the literature I began to read and see, as I also started reading the autobiography of Gandhi, was my first introduction to the African National Congress and to the struggle in South Africa. And I would like to add to that the study of the struggle of nonviolence, the study of the African struggle, South Africa, should be what happens to activists all around the country, all around the world, because activism is alive and well. But the big issue is that so many activists don't know how to carry on activism, like the folk who organized the African National Congress back in the early part of the 20th century, or that long struggle. It's a casebook history that ought to be looked at again and again for great variety of the issues, the massive variety, including how the United Democratic Front became the agency for the transformation out of apartheid. Over 500 organizations united. And many of us in the United States were friends of that struggle for decades. And I remember the demonstrations in Los Angeles at the South African consulate, where I sat in on a number of occasions. The South African huge demonstrations at UCLA. I also wanted to just simply add to that, Dr. Boesak has already mentioned the international solidarity, but I want to emphasize the fact that the solidarity began in many ways through the churches.
Yes, yes.
And the clergy, many of whom were connected to the ecumenical movement of that day, so that the World Council of Churches became one of the first groups not only that regularly worked against apartheid in South Africa, but became one of the very first agencies that called for divestment across the earth.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Christianity called for divestment and called for the churches of the world to take the leadership in doing it. So it is perhaps the shining illustration of the international solidarity that can take place around a particular national struggle, which also has its international meanings and all the rest of that as well. So I was especially proud of the movement in the United States because it swept our country, and it again brought students, the university was a major scene for the movement in the United States. Many campuses created a South African village
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right.
on their campuses, and lived there and operated out of it and so forth. So it was a very dramatic movement here in the United States, and also showed the extent to which the university can be a major site for the transformation of a nation and a transformation of our earth.
Thank you for drawing that link between the anti-apartheid movement in the United States and the critical role that our students within the University of California played in that fight. Reverend Boesak, as a leading theologian and scholar, I was wondering if you might comment on the particular role of the South African churches in spearheading the fight against apartheid.
Oh, absolutely. When Reverend Lawson was talking, I was thinking that some of my most precious memories in the late 1970s, especially the 1980s, linked to the United States, are my working with and cooperation with students at the colleges and the universities across the United States. And I have given up trying to remember which colleges and how many colleges I had visited. Because
right.
I mean, I remember somebody telling me, you were in Indiana and you were speaking at university here. And I said to him, no, I know I never was here because I couldn't remember.
Yes.
But the next day he came back to my office. I was teaching at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. And he came back to me and he brought a picture. And it was a picture of me with students protesting in Indiana. And he said to me, can you argue with this one now? So there is that the students and the energy and the honesty and the integrity that the students brought to the movement, the fearlessness with which they put administrations under pressure was a beautiful thing to see. And that connected with the churches. Of course, you're absolutely right. I remember Jeremiah Wright telling me that when in 1979 or 77, they sent out, or he sent out, invitations to 300 Black churches to join the anti-apartheid movement. He got responses in that first year of only 3. Only 3. But 2 years later, the whole picture began to change. And by the 1980s, the churches were so strong. And remember the World Council of Churches, with its program to combat racism, really in that sense, took the lead. The World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982 followed up with their declaration of apartheid as a sin and a heresy and a blasphemy. And that made it almost impossible for the churches to ignore the issue, both as a political issue, but also as a theological issue, and an issue of their political and their Christian integrity. And so it was wonderful. And for us, Kent, in South Africa, of course, Albert Luthuli, during the Defiance Campaign and into the early years of the 1960s, were very, very critical of the South African churches, because they would not join the Black Christians in their struggle. He had scathing words to say about what he thought as the lack of Christian prophetic witness. He said, I see a wreck of Christian witness instead of anything else. So his critique towards the churches really hung in the air until the beginning of the 1970s, because then Steve Biko picked it up in 1972 in speaking to the Black churches. And he said 2 things. He said, in the beginning, Jim, he said, in the beginning, the white missionaries brought Christianity to South Africa and made Christianity the perfect instrument and the most effective instrument for the subjugation and the colonization of our people. But then he said, nowadays, looking at us, the Black church, nowadays it is the Black church with its interpretation of the Bible that keeps our people subjugated through Christianity. Now, my generation, the Black consciousness generation in South Africa, heard that. It was painful to hear, but it was necessary. So that was reinforced, of course, by the Children's Revolution in 1976. By 1979, Archbishop Desmond Tutu took over the leadership of the South African Council of Churches, and that changed the whole thing. Black leaders came in, they supported him in the proposal that he said. We had long debates in 1979 about the churches supporting mass movements of civil disobedience led by the students and the children. And we had those fights with the South African government. And by 1983, when we formed the United Democratic Front, the churches were in the forefront of the struggle. And I will say this, I think, and we were driven by Albert Luthuli, who said, what I want most of all is to get into the struggle with my Christianity and pray that it changes for the good the character of our resistance. And that is what the churches saw. If we could be part of the struggle, not Christianizing the struggle, but infusing the struggle with our faith, with our beliefs, and with our courage, and saying to people openly, this is what we do because of Jesus. That had an amazing impact. People from other religions got the freedom to say what their religion meant for them in the struggle. And when you put those things together, I think that if it were not for the churches, Jim, the character, the non-violent changes that we have seen in South Africa, the character of our change and the character of our revolution would have been vastly different. So for me, the churches have played this marvelous, marvelous role. Now, 27 years into our democracy, and that's a different conversation. But I should say this, that I think the churches have mostly lost their prophetic voice, and now younger people are challenging us again in saying, tell us what the churches did then, and tell us what you want us to do now to bring back a powerful, positive Christian presence into our struggles today.
Yes.
Thank you, Reverend Boesak. Reverend Lawson, might you comment on this very issue, because we've already addressed in this class the critical role of the Black church in the Nashville sit-in movement, in the Memphis sanitation workers strike, and in expanding throughout the South in over 200 cities and towns, this campaign against Jim Crow, which was very much supported and inspired by Black churches. So tell me about that transformation here, and what do you see, how it parallels what happened in South Africa?
Well, in the case of the Black church, the heart of our struggles in the 1960s and 70s, the 50s and 60s and 70s, about a 20-year period. And I want to remind Allan that he preached at Holman United Methodist Church during this apartheid effort, as did also Desmond Tutu, because our congregation was very deeply engaged in that struggle in the 70s and 80s. Yes, it has to be said that in the United States, if it had not been for the Black church, we could not have had the movement. It's true. Because in the United States, in the southeastern part of the country, where the segregation was documented by laws and signs everywhere across the South and South Central part of the country, no wetbacks, no colored, white colored drinking fountains and waiting rooms, the whole vast business. We could not meet in any public buildings. there was no space where we could meet. And that's why it also here became such some church historians have called it the Black church movement in the United States in the 20th century. Well, in all over the southeastern part of the country, there was at least one Black church and minister never happy with segregation. And so even when many other churches would not move, there was at least one or a handful of Black churches that were constantly teaching and preaching against the segregation and the racism, and doing so in the name of the religion of Jesus, insisting that the religion of Jesus did not permit the violence, did not permit the racism, did not permit the sexism, did not permit especially the economic cruelty and torture of racism in the United States. And so we now have, this has not really been studied here, Allan. That's one of my great agonies. But we do have a couple of Black scholars who are unpacking some of this now. And we know that in the 60s, there were at least 200 cities in the southeastern part of the country where, in fact, the nonviolent movement was emulated in the desegregation of the city. The signs, small cities, large cities, the no colored signs, the segregation in the public arena coming down, the laws being eventually canceled out and obliterated, and the customs of the public segregation. Now, I want to add one other word. In both Montgomery, 1955, and Nashville, 1959, it was Black women who led the way in an analysis of the public segregation that said it needed to stop, that it was the cruelest thing in the world, and that that was the place where we had to begin. The bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and in Nashville, Tennessee, the sit-in campaign. So there are many connections between the South African experience and the experience here in relationship with the Black church. And Allan, one of the things that I reflect about, and I've not rarely talked about it anywhere, but one of the things that I reflect on and think about is whether or not in the 20th century, the Black church will be able to continue the struggle. It should be said that in the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black church across the country is the place where Black Lives networks are allowed to meet and are able to organize out of those churches all across the country. That is still going on. So it's a great omen for the continuation of the struggle, because the struggle is not over here.
Oh, no, it isn't over there. It isn't over
economic
here.
justice issue.
No, clearly.
Yeah.
And you know, Jim, one of the things that encourages me is the number of young people, young theologians, young Christians, who now come to me. I speak on Zoom 2 or 3 times a week, mostly with these young people. And they are saying to me, we understand where we are now. We understand there is a new struggle going on. We see the struggles globally, and we want to know how we are connected to those. And so they are talking to me, and I'm talking to them. There's a young group of students, of theologians, who just the other day talked about, and Jim will remember, a thing called the Institute for Contextual Theology, led by Frank Chicani and Father Albert Nolan. That's the institute that produced the Kairos document in 1985, together with theologians across the country. But these young people are saying to me, we think that we should re-establish something like that to concentrate our ecumenical efforts, to lift up the prophetic voice of the church and to bring back the prophetic presence of the church. Now, I must say, when I hear something like that, and I did my presentation, we had a 2-hour discussion, which I thought was a great discussion. When I hear something like that, it tells me there is something wonderful that is happening. We are on the verge of a rebirth, of a Christian participation in the struggles for justice in the world that we might not have seen for the last 15, 20 years. And I'm just so excited about that. I cannot wait for something to happen here.
Good.
I wanted to go back to this whole issue of the divestment movement, Reverend Lawson, and I know that you were actively involved in building support for that within the United States. The reality, however, is that even today, we have thousands and thousands of US troops stationed in Africa. Even today, we have US corporations who are propping up racism and injustice in many parts of Africa and other parts of the world. So what are your thoughts in terms of the continuing role of the US military and US corporations in Africa and what could be done about it?
Yes, this is one of the issues Ellen and I wanted to bring up as a contemporary character. And I am greatly pleased to hear you talking about the many young people who are committed to that. And Kent Wong and I see a lot of that in Los Angeles persistently. And that's part of the role of this class, to help young people become activists in the best way for the changes that we have to do. We are more than excited about the fact that the undocumented students really had its most important beginnings here at UCLA.
Right, right.
and we had a number of those people in our classes who took heart from the movement of the 60s and 70s as the foundation of their organizing, unafraid,
Right.
as undocumented people in the United States. So anyway, Kent, I've had a slip.
You were talking about the role of US military and US corporations in Africa today.
Ellen, we have a 6th Pentagon Command now, organized in 2008 by George W. Bush.
Right.
It's called the Africa Command. Its headquarters initially were in Munich, Germany. I don't know if they've established an African headquarters yet. They plan to do it because they plan to build military bases down the east coast of Africa.
Right.
We now have 6,000 troops on the ground in 43 African countries. And in at least 3 of those countries, including Niger and Northeast Congo, those troops are engaged in fighting so-called terrorist groups.
Yeah.
And as I've watched that development in the United States, though I have not yet read a major piece on it in recent months, I have done so with a great deal of horror in my soul. Because for me, that represents that Africa will become the Libya, the Iraq, the Central Asia of the 21st century. That the battle will be over the wealth that Western civilization has pulled from Africa for over 600 years into the Europe and New York and London and Berlin and Stockholm. And in fact, shortly after this command was announced, there were analysts for investments that went around Africa, and they reported that in the northeast section of the Congo alone, there were $27 trillion worth of minerals, many of them the major deposits of minerals that are needed for technology in the United States and Europe.
Exactly.
So I dread what this represents. And so
I share your fears in that regard. We saw under President Obama how Africa was expanded. I don't know either whether they have established their headquarters here. I think that may have been delayed by the unrest and the violence in places like Nigeria and the Arab Spring in Algeria and in Sudan and in Mali and now again. So that may have derailed those plans, maybe temporarily. I'm hoping permanently, because what the young people are doing in that part of Africa is they are absolutely resisting those old power-hungry men who do not want to give up power. I mean, there we have Museveni in Uganda, having made himself available and stolen the election for a 6th term. And as long as that kind of corruption goes on, it makes Africa wide open for the kind of exploitation that you're talking about. But the other thing that is there is the wealth that you have mentioned and the Congo. And I've often said, this internal fight, the civil war that we have in the Congo will never end because the Congo is simply too wealthy. And as long as the country can be kept unstable by outside and internal forces, and as long as corporations, I was in the Congo and I saw this, how people representing corporations fly in with their private jets into the northeastern province where the government has no control and where there is fighting, and they bring in arms or they bring in money and they take out the diamonds without paying royalties to the Congolese government. Now, when you see that kind of thing going on, and all these new minerals, rare earth that is necessary for cell phones and computers and laptops, and for especially for the development of electric motor cars. All those things are in the Congo, and some of them are in Tanzania. And I dread the day when they'll be discovered closer to us in Southern Africa as well. But so that is the third thing. The second thing. The third thing is the presence of China. So the rivalry that we used to see in the 1960s and 70s and 80s between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States as the two superpowers trying to control the world and exploit the world for their own benefit is what we're going to see with China. China is already a larger investor in Africa than the United States and Europe put together. And China has a different approach. China is not arrogant like the West. They don't come in there and they throw their weight around. China talks about cooperation. China offers a country like Ghana, we'll build you a new parliament building, we'll build your university, we'll build your roads, we'll make loans available to you at much, much better terms than the IMF. And so you get our African government captured by China in a way that we haven't been captured. And we don't, and the problem with Africa is, you remember, Jim, in the early days of African independence, we had amazing leaders. We had Nkrumah, we had Julius Nyerere, people of that caliber we haven't seen in Africa for years. Mandela came, but it was too short and he's gone. So, but there's nobody in Africa right now that I can say is a leader of the caliber of a Julius Nyerere that could bring us a new mindset in our thinking about what is the meaning of the politics, as W.E. Du Bois say, the politics of decency, of virtue, of courage, and of integrity. That is gone. I'm hoping that the new president of Tanzania, President President Hassan, that she might be the embodiment of that kind of leadership that Shirley Jones used to be, but we'll have to see. But I share all of this, and so for me, that is another reason why all these movements of resistance that have a different vision, a different hope for the future, a different structure in their minds about their society, that we should come together, that we should make those connections, that we should support one another, that we should inspire one another, and make this movement against worldwide imperialism, even if it is from the dying American empire or the rising Chinese empire, make that a worldwide struggle for the sake of humanity. And so, again, I mean, I'm just so excited about the work that you guys are doing, and I'm hoping that we can make those connections in your work, in our work, more prominent in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Reverend Boesak. I wanted to, build on that theme. I was very much inspired by your book, Dare We Speak of Hope. And one thing that I was particularly intrigued by was your deep understanding of the link between the struggles in South Africa and the struggles in the United States, and your own participation after years of teaching and working in the United States, and the role you played in educating many people in this country about the situation in South Africa. But I wanted to build on that theme. We had an earlier session on Black Lives Matter, and I wanted you to reflect on how you saw the global impact of the Black Lives Matter movement in this country.
Well, I mean, my understanding about the connectedness of our struggles, I'm thinking now especially of the United States and of South Africa, came when I visited the US in 1973. And I'm not sure, Jim, whether it was in that period that we met or the period of the 1980s, but it was around that time. And I had gone back to the Netherlands and wrote an academic piece, which the seminary there published before my doctoral dissertation, called Coming In Out of the Wilderness. And it was a comparison of the ethics of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Mm-hmm. And I discovered even then in 1974 that the Martin Luther King that was mostly praised and hailed across the world is not the real Martin, that he is much more radical than the world was allowing him to be. And I discovered what he was saying about democratic socialism and so forth. And so for me, already in those days, the link and the connections were clear. And during the 1980s, that was, of course, seen very practically in the work that we were doing together. And now every book that I have published since then, I try to keep that as the golden thread that goes through that. I say in the book that what we are facing is a worldwide oppressive imperialist force, and what we must put over against that is a worldwide anti-imperialist force for justice and humanity, and so forth. And so the book that's coming out now is a book on Steve Biko, but Jim, in that book, there's a whole chapter on Martin Luther King and how he influenced my thinking. Mm-hmm. And how we brought that thinking into our struggles through the United Democratic Front. And it's so that is one thing. Now, however, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement has sprung up in a way with an energy and with a force that is inclusive it is intergenerational, it is interreligious. It brings all these people together. It takes people's minds off the single issue struggles that they used to fight. And I see in the Black Lives Matter movement, I see the labor people, I see trade union people, I see students asking for fees that must be canceled. I see LGBTQI people, I see the rainbow flag, I see feminist groups. It is an amazing thing. And what I see is also that all the movements that followed in Holland, in all over Europe, in South Africa, it is the pattern and the way in which Black Lives Matter has manifested itself. I mean, who would have thought that a German football club in Berlin would kneel, take the knee before they play? That's Black Lives Matter. Who would think? I mean, this young man who wins every single motor race he's ever done, young Lewis, who made it very, very clear that he is with Black Lives Matter. And I mean, and so all of his millions of fans across the world are now Black Lives Matter people, whether they want to be or not, because if you love him, you got to love the causes he stands for that are good causes. So I'm hoping that Black Lives Matter in the United States will see the utter significance of what they have been doing. And not just around the great moments of George Floyd and so on. I mean, you should have seen how people here in South Africa reacted to the George Floyd thing, for instance, which warmed my heart. But that they will not be frightened by that and withdraw from the global scene and say, let's keep this an American thing, but that they will continue to assert themselves, continue to make alliances across the world, continue to see the value and the importance of those connections. And I just think, just as the civil rights struggle, remember, Jim, in the 1960s, after Sharpeville, Black political activity in this country was viciously suppressed by the South African government. We had no movement. Everything was a little bit was underground. People were in exile. Mandela and the others were sent to Robben Island. There was a vacuum. But and this is the way God works. While we were driven underground and there was a vacuum in Black activity, the 1960s was the epitome of the rise of the civil rights movement in the United States under the leadership of the church. And so by the time we recovered in the 1970s through Black consciousness and the new image of the Black church, we could drink from the wells that you guys have kept open. I always think of the story of Isaac, how they say in the Bible that the Philistines had sort of stopped with sand and rocks every single well that his father Abraham had opened. But you guys kept those wells open for us. Yeah. And so when we needed to drink for inspiration, we could go to you. And when I mentioned the name Martin Luther King from the stage, I mean, we were singing in the 1980s, we were singing We Shall Overcome.
Yes.
In South Africa.
Yes.
And it's all there. Instinctively, people felt. And again, I'm saying this is now a new moment. It's almost a kairos moment for the prophetic movement in the world. And you guys are part of it. We must be part of it. And I hope that we can make something come to life in this.
Well, Kent Wong and I have been teaching that the most important issue is the development of nonviolent campaigns in the United States. Yes. That will make the campaigns in the 60s look pale.
Yes.
That's the only hope for our country. And Black Lives Matter is a part of my imagination for the future.
Well, right.
But the other thing I wanted to say about this is, Ellen, is that I've come to a conclusion about the economic scene.
Yeah. Because
I call what we have in the United States plantation capitalism. I have not engaged in the socialist, Marxist critique of capitalism. I have said that the plantation capitalism is the beginning of capitalism in the United States.
Right.
I learned this from Black men who used to call their working places the plantation.
Right.
And I maintain that it is that form of the economics of our world, plantation. That is where working people do not count.
That's
They
right.
are not visible. They are
That's
out
right.
of the picture.
That's
They
right.
are property and slavery. And their wages and benefits are to be kept low. That plantation capitalism has its great emphasis on wealth gathering,
Yes.
where human beings see their own self-identity in their gathering of wealth. And accompanying that gathering of wealth, land,
Yeah.
money, property,
Yeah.
in that their own identity. Their human value is based upon the gathering of wealth. And also their human value is in the power they achieve in dominating the scenery where their wealth is located. So that in the United States, the plantation owners, even in the West, the large, which we call the large ranches, dominated the minute politics as well as the state and regional and provincial politics, and
Right.
thereby also the national politics.
Right.
So I maintain that a part of knowing what we have to do is that we have to abolish plantation capitalism in the United States and across the world. That it, and as you were talking about the wealth, the wealth coming into the Congo on their own private planes,
Yeah.
pointed
Yeah.
out the diamonds, I couldn't
Yeah.
help but think of what that represents, you see.
Yeah.
The,
Yeah.
the demand in the United States that the flow of wealth be from Africa to the banks and to the investment firms in the
Exactly.
United States of Berlin is a major handicap to the new world that we have to have.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And I think plantation capitalism sums it up very, very well. Only it's now a global plantation.
Yes, yes,
That
because
they,
I remember in the 60s and 70s, reading about the rubber plantations in Africa, as an
yes, yes, in the Congo,
yeah,
in the
that's right.
Congo again, in the Congo.
Yeah,
I
the
mean, where in
horrible Belgium.
1910, yeah, Leopold II killed 10 million Congolese
Yes,
in a Holocaust that is never talked about and that is kept hidden because
yes,
it doesn't suit the dominant narrative of the plantation capitalist of the world.
yes, yes.
And that is where we are. And so, I mean, it reminds me also of Martin Luther King's Vietnam speech, where he singled out those three evils of racism and capitalism and material and militarism.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how these things still go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
In the global exploitation of the people of the world, and in the alliances that the minions of empire in our countries in the global south are willing to make with those capitalists, because it is for their benefit. They don't care about their people.
Yeah.
And it's another reason
Well,
why
the robbery of the wealth of Africa that continues today is a critical reason why the civil war in the Congo goes on.
Oh, absolutely. That's why it goes on.
Yeah.
And that is why every time there is a people's uprising, it gets hijacked by forces from outside, or it gets hijacked by forces from inside back, like Egypt was hijacked by forces from outside with the help of El Sisi and his men to reinstall the tyranny. It is that kind of thing that we must constantly keep in mind, that we must analyze, and we must find ways, because there are people there, Jim, who think like you explained right now, who think like us. and we must make connections with those people. Because if you don't make those connections, people are tempted to think we are all on our own. We are fighting these battles all on our lonesome. And that is never true. There's a vast mass of people. And that, what is that text in the Bible where Elisha says to his servant, when the servant talks about the armies of the king,
Yes.
says, those who are with us are more than those who are with them.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that is something we should remind people of.
This has been such a powerful conversation between the two of you. I wish we could spend a few more hours together. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. But you know, in addition to both of you playing such a critical role internationally in advancing the philosophy of nonviolence, in addition to both of you playing leading roles as theologians and as scholars and as activists and as people deeply engaged in social justice and social change, you have both also played a critical role in lifting up the next generation and encouraging young people to get involved in the movement. And so if I could just ask each of you to reflect on a last message to the 200 students in our class at UCLA, but the hundreds and hundreds of other young people across the United States who are watching this, what is your advice for them in terms of those who are just getting started as social justice activists and who are maybe for the first time seeing their collective power? So what are your recommendations to this new generation?
Will you want to go first?
Well, I'll let you have the last word, Ellen. I'll go first. Just simply to point out to our class that in Allan Boesak, you have a wonderful illustration of a life committed to the truth and to justice, especially to people, breaking the chains that for too many centuries have been imposed upon all kinds of people around the world, but especially in his own country. And so I would urge you, if you can, to see in this man one of the symbols of what we have to have again and again in this 21st century. Nonviolence offers us the power and the tactics by which we can overcome the violence, the militarization of our world, and therefore the injustice of the world.
Well, thank you, Jim, for your kind words. I simply want to say, I want every young person to remember that all these movements that we have been talking about, whether in India, through Gandhi, whether in South Africa, through the youth of 1976 and in 1983, and the Black Lives Matter movement, all these revolutions, in Martin King's sense of the word, are driven by young people. So what made our revolution unique from the previous ways of struggle was that young people did not just participate, they were willing to take up the leadership. And I keep on thinking, and I mustn't go on because I get always emotional when I think about it, what did they have when they were there in 1976? They were 15, 16, and 17 years old. They had their dreams, their aspirations, they had their hopes for themselves, how they saw themselves. And yet they gave all of that up, all of it, put it on the altar, their lives on the line every day. I know, because I buried one every second week. And they gave it all up. Why? Not for themselves, because I could not, nor could Desmond Tutu go on stage and promise them, just this month, by the end of this month, everything will be okay. Or just next year, we'll have our freedom. We could never say that. So they did that without knowing where this will end and where they will be if it ends. And yet they did it because they did it for the next generation. They said, the South Africa we have now cannot be the South Africa that our children must have. And that is the power of young people committed to a cause. And I I mean, people ask me, why were you so courageous? Not me, it's not me. I was always encouraged and inspired by the courage of those young people who went on the streets every single day and challenged the mightiest government on the continent of Africa with their love and their sacrifices. And so you don't know what you can do. Have faith in yourselves. Have faith in the power that is within you. Unleash it in a way that only nonviolent militant resistance can do. And you will see how we will change this world as the young people before you have changed their world. God bless you all.
Yeah, absolutely. Terrific.
Thank you so much, Reverend Boesak. It has indeed been an honor to have you join us today, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jim. God bless you guys.
Great
Thank you.
to see you. Great to see you.
Wonderful to see you, and congratulations for that thing that'll happen in September.
Yeah. Amen.